In the last video, we learned how to call APIs in Python, but honestly, many developers stop there. They simply write requests.get and assume everything will work perfectly. But real-world system fails all the time. And if you don't handle that properly, your application becomes unreliable very quickly. So in the application, you can face different issues, like if you are not using timeout, then you will get failures. If you are not using proper error handling, then also there are issues, and this also makes the use of that API quite unsafe for your application. So let's see an example of a timeout issue. So consider this web request response cycle where the API sits inside the server and we are consuming the API as a client. So we are sending a request, and this request is our API request, and server processes that API request and returns the response. Now if we do not use any timeout, what will happen? So for example, we have sent the request and server is taking little time to process our request, or server is stuck. In such cases, there is a long waiting time, and this waiting time could be forever. This could result in hampering the flow of our application, or our application can also stuck for the response for a longer time. So what will happen if we use timeout? Using timeout helps solving this complete issue. So if we send the request and for example we are using a timeout of 5 seconds, our machine will only wait for 5 seconds for the response and it will continue further. So by using timeout, the application flow will not be disrupted. So this is what we are going to cover in this whole tutorial. We are going to understand how to call APIs properly in Python, where we will target how senior developers or professionals usually make an API call in Python. So what we are going to cover throughout this tutorial, we are going to understand how to use timeout while making an API call, how to do status code validation, and how we can do exception handling. So let me quickly jump to my Visual Studio Code screen. So here in the last video we have this example of making an API request in Python. So this is the common beginner approach where we import the request library, we create a response variable where we fetch the response using the request.get, and we print it or consume it using response.json. And then if you have to fetch any specific elements, then we use slicing indexing. Now this works until the server becomes slow, the API fails, the internet disconnects, or the response is invalid. So we have already seen why timeout matters. Now let's see how we can utilize it. In this request.get, we are simply going to add another parameter which is timeout, and this timeout takes an integer value. So for example, we have to set a timeout of 5 seconds. Now what will happen by adding this timeout? The request.get waits only for 5 seconds to get the response, and it will come out of this request. Let me quickly run this code. So here you can see we get the result after 5 seconds. Now the next important factor is the status code validation. Many developers assume that every response is successful, but that's not true. So whenever we make an API request, it not always returns a successful response. It can also return unauthorized issues, server failures. So for every response, there is a status code associated with it. So for a successful status code, it is 200. Some other common status code are 404, which is for not found whenever the API is not found. 401 is for unauthorized, and 500 is for server failures. If you want to understand these all status codes in detail, let me know in the comment section. We will try to create a separate tutorial on it. Let's see how we can check the status code. Let me clear this up. So for a successful response, as I told, the status code is 200. So what we are going to do, we are going to write an if-else statement here, and I am going to check the response dot status code. So status code is a method which returns the exact status code value, and we need to compare this value to the status code that we are actually validating with. So 200 is for successful response. So here I'm writing if response.status code equal to 200, this means my response is successful, and then only I will print the result. So for example, response.json, else I will print API request failure. Let me quickly run this code. So here you can see we got the request.json data. This means our status code was 200, which represents successful response. Now next, let's make our code more safer by adding exception handling. So why exception handling is important? As I mentioned, there could be multiple issues while you are making an API request. For example, timeout, or we can also have a connection error. To handle all these exceptions or errors, we need to use exception handling. So how we can do all this? So as we know, for adding exception handling, we need to add a try except block. So I'm going to add the try block first, and inside the try block we are going to add our code of fetching the response and checking the status code, and after all this I will put a except block. Now there are some built-in exceptions that you can check using the request library. So for example, I have to check for an timeout issue. I can write requests.exceptions.timeout. So this is going to raise a timeout exception, and then based on timeout except I can print my response. So for example, request timeout. Similarly, I can also have an exception based on connection error. So except request.exceptions.connection error, and I can print a message based on this exception as well, connection failure. Now let me run this file again. Now because I'm using dummy API, which is always sending a successful response, these exceptions are not raised, but we can see all these examples whenever we are going to work with fast API. But yeah, this is how we can add exception handling in our code to handle an API call or to handle an API request. But here is an important tip. Beginners usually write code assuming that system will work, but experienced developers always write code assuming that system will fail. So with this, we have come to the end of this video session, where we have covered some of the best practices like using timeout, having status code validation, exception handling, etc. So if you really like this video, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can hit that like button, or if you have any suggestion, you can pin down those suggestions in the comment box, and you can also email us at the given email ID. Thank you so much for watching this video. We will meet you in the next one.